The Golden State Warriors have obviously been one of the most interesting teams of the past decade in the NBA, with all their success with and without KD, while Steph and Klay and Draymond, these guys were all in their primes, and then also coming back to win a title in the 2020s as well. But we're getting to a new era of Warriors basketball, and the way that this season has gone points us in a very negative direction for Golden State. Coming into the year for the Warriors, I was actually cautiously optimistic because I've never been someone really to count out this team. I always feel like they're going to be able to figure it out. They're going to be able to find a way, and if they're healthy, especially after shifting around the roster, bringing in Chris Paul, getting rid of Jordan Poole, bringing back Draymond on the extension, I thought that they were going to have a chance to be at least semi-contenders this season. And the only way that there weren't going to be significant changes moving forward into the future for Golden State was if they had a good year. This was always going to be an extremely pivotal year in terms of how we were going to view the next few seasons for Golden State, and they're not playing well. They're not a good basketball team, and there's a lot of different reasons for that, but it does start to inform not only the decision-making process moving forward for Golden State as it relates to Klay Thompson and a ton of other guys on the roster, but also makes you think about how they got here and the decisions that they made to basically miss on an incredible opportunity to continue this great run that they've been on. And it's interesting too, because everything that Golden State did to be good initially, to build that first era, to have Steph and Klay and Draymond and all these other guys, everything that they did well then, they're doing wrong now. They were an incredibly good drafting team, of course, bringing in Steph, Klay, and Draymond. None of those guys were top 5 picks. Draymond, of course, was in the second round. They developed those guys over a span of a handful of years. They were always able to get veterans and good free agency signings, and they were always just a step ahead of everyone else. And that even goes on to, of course, being able to bring in KD in free agency in 2016. And now, when you look at how they got to where they are, they're making mistakes in areas that they never made before. They have multiple guys and have had multiple guys on this roster over the last couple of seasons that were supposed to kind of bridge the gap. They tried the 2 timeline thing, right? They had a top 3 pick. They had James Wiseman at number 2 overall. He was terrible. One of the worst top 5 picks that we've seen in the NBA over the last handful of seasons. Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody, these were guys that, Kuminga's case was supposed to have this incredibly high ceiling, and Moody's case was supposed to be this nice role player for them. Neither of those guys have worked out. Obviously Jordan Poole was good for them. They ended up having to dump him because they paid him all this money, but they're not being efficient in terms of drafting players, despite having really good opportunities, especially for a contending team over the last handful of years, to draft well, and they're still not doing a good job. Now, granted, that 2020 draft was weird. The only counter that I will ever make about Golden State making the choice to go with James Wiseman at number 2 overall is I don't know what they would have done if they had gotten the first pick, if they would have gone Anthony Edwards or not, and I don't know really what the process would have looked like if it was a regular year. Maybe they would have picked LaMelo at 2, and think about any of those 3 guys, Anthony Edwards if they had the first pick, LaMelo if they'd taken him at 2, or Tyrese Halliburton, who also, by the way, is in that draft. Think about any of those 3 guys in this Warriors team. Kind of breaks my brain. But the only counter to the Wiseman situation going poorly that I would give is that 2020 class was weird. The world was basically shut down. They were doing interviews on Zoom. The draft process was not normal. Now, granted, other teams still managed to do well in that draft, but that's the counter there. But regardless, whether it's Wiseman, Kuminga, Moody, any of the other opportunities that they've had, they have not built this team well, and it's led them to this place that they are in now, where they are so incredibly reliant on the guys that they were relying on to help win titles 6-7 years ago. This is the most Steph-reliant Warriors team that we've ever seen, because Klay is still there, and they're still trusting him a lot. He's not been very good. Draymond's getting himself kicked out of games every other week, and Wiggins has been fine, and some of these other guys have been fine, but we've never seen a team like this with the Warriors, in terms of a team that we thought might be able to contend, that has had to rely this much not only on Steph, who's been really good, but also on other guys who haven't been as good in Klay and Draymond. And speaking of Klay, this is where things get weird for Golden State, because if this was almost any other team, like if this was a Warriors team or one of the other teams around the league that, maybe you won one title a handful of years ago, and there wasn't this connection that the city and the franchise felt to this group of players. I mean, Steph, Draymond, Klay, these guys are probably going to have a statue outside of the arena for years. This is one of the most successful trios that we've seen in the history of the league in terms of winning titles, in terms of basically not losing playoff series ever when they're all healthy and they're all out there. But they're at the point now where the Klay situation, in my opinion, has to be resolved. It has to be something that they get figured out, whether they figure out a new contract, whether they trade him, whatever the case may be. They have to make some kind of change. They can't just continue to to go out night after night and expect Klay to be who he was before all the injuries. It's not really his fault. The injury situation is tough, but it's a situation that needs to be resolved. And there's two problems for that. One, if you did look to trade him, there's not going to be a ton of value for him around the league, not to mention the fact that that would be a really tough decision to make emotionally for the team because of how much Klay has meant to the franchise, as I mentioned earlier. And then also, of course, he's an impending free agent, which lowers his trade value to another team and makes this that much more difficult of a situation for Golden State because they have to figure out what they are or are not willing to pay Klay Thompson on a long-term deal after this season. And the only way that all of this was going to work out this season is if the Warriors were good this year. If the Chris Paul thing worked, if Klay came back better, if Draymond, was still really good and actually playing in the games, and Steph, of course, was awesome, and their depth and their young guys continued to improve and grow. If all that stuff happened, then it was going to be fine. You'd be willing to overpay a little bit to keep Klay Thompson around. You'd be willing to maybe bring back Chris Paul next year as well and just continue to run it back despite the expense and the age of the roster. But because they're not very good, they're not terrible, but they're not very good. And again, it's an incredibly Steph reliant team. Because of that, it makes you think about it, makes you wonder what the next few years are going to look like in Golden State. This has always been a team that you've been focused on the immediate. Ever since they pursued and ultimately won the title a few seasons ago, all we were thinking about was what's the next year going to look like, the next year going to look like. We haven't really thought about, hey, what is the age 38 Steph Curry season look like? Who are the other guys out there? How are they going to continue to contend? And it's interesting because Steph is one of the few stars around the league that isn't going to pressure the front office to make moves. He's not going to pressure them to trade for another star. He's just not that kind of guy. And ironically, that might be what this Warriors team needs. But again, it's such a more complicated situation than that because of the emotional connection that the franchise and the fan base has with Steph, Klay, and Draymond. And in this case, most specifically Klay, in terms of how it's negatively impacting their team right now. And it's just made that much more difficult by the fact that these guys that were supposed to help ease them into the next era, they knew that their players were getting older, that they were going to need to make some adjustments. And the guys like Moody and Kuminga and Wiseman that were supposed to help them, basically like the model that the Spurs had when they got Kawhi, right? And then Tim Duncan and Tony Parker and Manu and these guys were able to take reduced roles because Kawhi got better and they ultimately had more success than they would have otherwise. And that just hasn't happened for Golden State. And it's a situation that almost doesn't have a solution because even if tomorrow Golden State decided, you know what, it's a really tough decision, but we do want to trade Klay Thompson. We do want to shake up our roster. We don't want to have to sign him to a new extension. And we don't want to just get nothing for him in the offseason. Even if they made that decision, who are they trading Klay Thompson for that's actually going to help their basketball team? And if they don't make that decision, if they say, you know what, we're going to try and figure it out, we're going to give our guys a chance to improve on this throughout the season, then what do you do when you get to the offseason? You risk losing Klay for nothing. You risk having to pay him way too much money. Maybe there is a team out there that's going to be willing to give Klay Thompson 20, 25, $30 million a year, which sounds like a massive number given his current production level, but sometimes that's the way that it works in free agency. And if you're Golden State, even as not helpful as Klay has been, even as not typical Klay Thompson as he's been, you still don't want to just lose a guy like that for nothing. And again, that could be an incredibly damaging move as well to kind of the psyche of the team because of how much Klay has meant to them over the years. And I really don't know what the solution is. This is more so just a situation that I'm monitoring because I think if you took the situation without context, a guy in an expiring contract that might have some value around the league, that's still a really good shooter at times on certain nights, and the roster just needed a shake up, and you look at the contracts and you look at the expense, I think if you looked at all that collectively, it'd be really easy to just say, oh, well, we got to trade this guy. We have to trade this guy to another team. We'll get value. We'll shake up the roster. We'll change things up. Our lineup will make more sense. Chris Paul will start. All that stuff. Boom, we're in there. It all makes sense again. But then when you add the context of the fact that it's Klay Thompson and it's the Warriors and trying to figure out, kind of what you're going to do with Steph and trying to continue to compete over the next couple of seasons, it gets that much more complicated in a almost impossible situation to solve in Golden State.